So, I don't know, maybe it was 6 weeks ago, I get feeds from academia, that website, and suddenly there was something about 21st century, no, it was 21st century Proudhonists. And I said, what? And because there had been exchange in my Gmail, this is part of how search engines optimize things and put things in your inbox when you are organizing something like the MEP. I got this notice, I went to academia, read the article, and the next day I made an effort to reach Radhika, who got back to me right away. And I am so pleased that she said yes. I listened to you present at a left forum here in New York when it was at Pace, so that must be 10 years ago.
A decade ago, yes.
And then reading that PDF that academia provided let me know how much other work, and we got on the phone, and this is the first of 3 appearances that Radhika will be making with the MEP and GERG, the Geopolitlcal Economy Research Group. We are doing this tonight. On Saturday, October 31st, there will be a presentation on the section of the Grundrisse, pre-capitalist economic formations. And then the first Saturday of December, we will have another visit and discussion concerning the section on Badiou and Carey, and the note Marx has there that leads to, is the birth, as Radhika says, of geopolitical economy. We at the MEP are so excited. We have Radhika, we have John Milius, who some of you may remember was the economic advisor on the left of Syriza, but has done a lot of work. He will be making a presentation on November 1st on commodity fetishism versus capital fetishism. And then Andy Merrifield will visit us later in November to speak of his new monthly review book, Marx, Dead and Alive, Reading Capital in Precarious Times. We have a volume 3 group going. Volume 1 group begins again this Saturday, and then we will start a cycle again with Grundrisse through volume 3 again. And your visits can't be more better timed for that, Radhika. With that, I don't know what you want to say about yourself or GERG, but it's the Zoom floor is yours, so to speak, now.
Okay, great. As Michael's, I'm very pleased to be here, and I have to say that this particular article to which I'm speaking, and I'll be happy to send the link. If you go to my academia.edu website, you can basically download it from there. It's one of the articles that I most enjoyed writing, and it comes at the confluence of many things. But in particular, it came out of a sort of, it came out of a sort of great irritation, I feel, every time these very famous personalities who are practically equated with Marxism, they radically misinterpret Marx. And I've been doing a lot of work on why Marx is so systematically misinterpreted. And since I won't have too much time to talk about it during the main talk itself, I'll simply say that it concerns the fact that few people understand the extremely insidious and pernicious influence of neoclassical economics on Marxism. It essentially gave rise to a Marxist economics, which in fact, it's a contradiction in terms, because Marx did political economy, critical political economy to be sure, but it's completely different from what's called economics. Economics emerges circa 1870 precisely because Marx's intervention has made classical classical political economy unusable for the purposes of legitimizing capitalism. A new discourse is needed and a new discourse appears. Anyway, I had lots of fun writing this because I feel that it's important to point out the mistakes people are making. So basically, I was invited to by a group of lawyers, funnily enough, to comment on the work of Badiou and Hardt and Negri and Zizek, particularly around this issue of commons and communism and this bunch of ideas. And so I ended up writing this paper. And in the course of the main basic argument I'm going to make is that Marx criticized Proudhon as a sort of particular petty bourgeois form of ideology. Proudhon wrote The Poverty of Philosophy, and as some of you may well know, Marx wrote a very biting critique of it called Proudhon wrote The Philosophy of Poverty, and Marx's critique is entitled The Poverty of Philosophy. And this also contains some, I mean, reading this is very instructive because the kinds of mistakes that Proudhon makes are precisely the sorts of, around the sorts of ways in which neoclassical economics wants us to look at the world. What Marx called vulgar economy is essentially the same thing as neoclassical economics. And so reading that also gives, alerts you to the difficulties of neoclassical, of economics generally. But so my point of view is that, or the argument I'm making is that Marx pointed out that Proudhon's ideology was a kind of petty bourgeois ideology, and so it was not a form of socialism. So what I'm pointing out is that this new communism of the commons is 21st century Proudhonism, in the sense that it is the spontaneous ideology of a class of people who essentially are what Poulantzas would have called the new petty bourgeoisie, essentially a sort of intellectual class, who also have the ambiguous class position that the petty bourgeoisie always had. So I want to make a few remarks in terms of an introduction, then I will give you a quick flavor of what these new communists of the commons are saying, and then I will go into my critique, first of all laying out what Proudhonism is, and then in what ways, in the ways in which the philosophy of these people actually is the 21st century Proudhonism. So broadly speaking, I think that the broad context is this. There was a conference that took place around 2010. So soon after the knockdown crisis of neoliberal financialized capitalism that occurred in 2008. And so here it is, here is this enormous apparatus of predatory finance is collapsing, and there is absolutely no discussion of financialization in their conception of communism. There is no discussion. The kind of capitalism that they are talking about is cognitive capitalism. So here you have, it's all about them. It's not about what's going on out there. It's about themselves as knowledge workers, philosophers, etc., etc. So no wonder, and it's precisely because these sorts of ideas so dominate and so grab the attention, they monopolize the attention of young people, would-be radicals, etc. So when their attention is sort of taken up by this, then how are they to pay proper attention to real radical ideas? So it's a bit like saying that the hunger for radical ideas is satisfied not by giving them nourishing food, but by giving them Coca-Cola and Twinkie bars. I mean, this is what's passing for radical ideas, and this is deeply problematic. And when you read this, what you also realize is that we need to return to not look at these substitutes. These people, they claim the authority of Marx, and it's quite interesting. I mean, I have no problem if these people peddle their ideas without reference to Marx. I wouldn't even bother to criticize them. But for whatever reason, they want to claim the authority of Marx while actually hollowing out Marx's analysis completely, like denaturing it completely. So that's one, and I think this is also connected up with another thing which they insist on a great deal. They very much identify as the generation of 68, and I think that much will be understood if we remember the following. Of course, in the generation of 68, there were many extremely honorable radicals that remained radical, that continued their radical work on and mobilizing work and intellectual work and so on. But if you think about the generation as a whole, Just imagine what has really happened in the case of that generation, what the generation has actually done. As it grew up and occupied positions of power in society, in politics, in the economy, politics moved to the right with neoliberalism. The right parties moved to the right, and the so-called left parties, Labour and Social Democratic parties, also moved to the right. This was the actual effect of the generation as a whole. So I feel that we have to also bear in mind that there has been a certain type of neoliberalism of the left that is also very important. So neoliberalism is sort of anti-state, keep the state out of, etc. The left has recreated that its own version of this neoliberalism, because what is the underlying thrust of these ideologies of the people we're talking about? It is anti-state and anti-party. We want socialism, but it cannot be about the state. And it should not involve party politics. So it involves essentially what I call Proudhonist economics. So, small property, capitalism, etc. And what I call network politics. So no state, no party. And we'll understand what this means as well. So I want to begin by giving you some of the flavor of the self-importance of this group of what I'm calling the new communists of the commons. So when Badiou's communist hypothesis was published, and then Hardt and Negri published their Commonwealth in the previous year, and then there was the conference volume that came out of the conference on the idea of communism, where all these people were involved. And the authors hailed these publications as a major political departure. So in the edited volume, Kostas Douzinas, who is a law professor, I think he's at Birkbeck, and Slavoj Zizek point out in this, they say, oh, we planned this conference only for about, less than 200 people, and eventually 1,200 people showed up, and it was amazing. And then this is a quote from their introduction. It says, this conference opened the way for a reactivation of the strong link between radical philosophy and politics. The massive participation, the amazing buzz that propelled the conference, strangers greeting each other like old friends, the good-humored, non-sectarian question and answer sessions, something rare for the left, all indicated that the period of guilt, and one presumes guilt over actually existing communism, was over. If this conference was a major intellectual encounter, it was an even greater political event. You can just see how they are basically gazing into their own navel. They are completely, not at all mindful of the fact that there has been this knockdown political crisis, out of which there has been, no major, apart from Occupy, there was no other major political radicalization. Not to be outdone in self-importance, Alain Badiou claimed about the same conference that in addition to the two people behind it, Zizek and himself, the great names of the true philosophy of our times were strongly represented. So essentially, so long as he and his friends were there, it's like all the great philosophers of the time were there. I mean, this is incredible to read this stuff. So, okay, so let me give you a quick flavor of what Badiou is saying. Badiou wants to revive the communist idea, not the communist movement, the communist idea. In doing so, he recalls the Paris Commune, the Cultural Revolution, and May 1968. So this is sort of an idea of the kind of politics you can get, which is against party and against state. Who are the subjects of this new communism? Essentially, the heirs of 68, the intellectuals, as he likes to see himself, and what he calls the new proletarians, essentially the most marginalized proletarians, so completely leaving aside bulk of the working class. They can be shifted away. And of course, since these new proletarians who are from Africa are hardly going to come to the podium and speak for themselves, they can claim whatever they want to claim about these new proletarians from Africa. The involvement of the party and the state is opposed as capitalo-parliamentarism, which is shared between social democracy and Leninism. So this is like an old paradigm of politics. forget it. And of course, there's this long discussion in which he says that I find Marx's discussion of the Paris Commune very ambiguous. So he, on the one hand, wants to claim the Paris Commune as something that he can say, you know, this is the kind of politics we represent, but at the same time, he does not want this Marx's analysis of it to get in the way of his claiming that there has to be a politics without party and a politics without state. Because if you read Marx's analysis of the Paris Commune, in fact, he points out just how much the general organization, the sort of planning of the economy was necessary. And that, you know, and therefore also there had to be an instrument that would do this, a party, etc. So he talks about that. He claims the idea of the withering away of the state for his own, completely misunderstanding what this concept actually means. So he wants essentially a politics without party and state. Hardt and Negri, what do they want? They want to resist the privatization of the commons. They also want to do this without state, without party. And they want to assert the autonomy of what they call the multitude from both private and public control. And so again, this idea of network politics, you know, we are going to cooperate, communicate, encounter, but we're not going to do much otherwise. And they want to challenge what they call the neoliberal privatization of the commons. So the resistance to the neoliberal privatization of the commons must not assume that the only alternative to the private is the public, that is managed and regulated by states and government authorities. According to them, what are the commons? The commons include all of nature, as well as those results, and I'm quoting, those results of social production that are necessary for social interaction and further production, such as knowledges, languages, codes, information, affects, and so forth. So these are the commons, and they are being privatized, and we have to resist that, but we cannot resist that with the state and party or anything. He quotes Marx, then interestingly, he says that Marx talks about the abolition of property. And he quotes Marx there, but of course he completely overlooks the fact that what Marx is criticizing is the abolition of private property, not of property as such. And we'll come to that in a minute when we understand how they radically misunderstand even the notion of the commons. So in what they call in the capitalism, which is primarily for them a cognitive capitalism, there is an increasing centrality of the commons commons in capitalist production. The production of ideas, affects, social relations, and forms of life are emerging as the conditions and weapons for a communist project, according to them. Of course, this idea that there is we have a knowledge economy, that we have cognitive capitalism, it's all seriously problematic, because anybody who reads Capital will know that Marx is very aware that all labor involves knowledge. There is no the famous distinction between the bee and the architect is at the cornerstone of Marx's understanding of labor. So, it's a bit like, people say knowledge economy. Well, where is the ignorance economy? Was there ever an ignorance economy? It's ludicrous concept. But anyway, there you are. Such capitalist production, according to Hardt and Negri, involves the production of forms of life which is becoming the basis of added value, thanks to human faculties, competences, knowledges, and affects, those accrued on the job, and more importantly, accumulated outside work, which are of directly productive value. Now, let's take a pause at this. This is astonishing. So first of all the value, most of the value that is added is now coming from knowledge. So they are also in a certain sort of way justifying the appropriation, in the various supply chains. The most powerful node in the supply chain appropriates most of the income. So just because they appropriate most of the income does not mean that all the value is produced there. The value may be produced in Bangladesh, but it's the office in New York that appropriates the profit. You don't have to justify that. It's as though you're erasing the contribution of those who actually produce these objects in Bangladesh. That's one point. Another point is that they're completely erasing, as I say, the actual production, the extraction of surplus value from this. And what's more, for them, what's involved is their ideas, the people like them, these people are producing all the value, and their value is added because of their competence, which are, acquired on the job and also outside the job. So they are essentially talking about the sorts of competences one acquires by, say, having a very refined cultural life, going to the opera and the theater and concerts and so on. And so this is their idea of how the competences of these cognitive workers, etc., will need to be reproduced, etc. So you see what this is all getting at. Zizek, let's take a look at him. What does he want? Okay, so Zizek is talking about, sorry, I just want to make this a bit bigger. Zizek, of course, is always interested in me more left than anybody else who is on the podium with him. So there he is, he's going to say, well, you know what? I'm going to expand the notion of the commons because it doesn't just include, knowledge and nature. It also includes our genetic heritage. He says, capitalism, folks, has serious antagonisms. Let's not forget that. The privatization of the commons is one antagonism, he says, and those who are excluded is another antagonism. Very nice of him to talk about the excluded, but he never talks to the excluded. He just talks about the excluded. So Marx's notion of the proletariat is for Zizek now not sufficiently radical, because poor Marx, all he could think of was the fact that the proletariat are those who have nothing to lose. Zizek says, no. The proletariat now is those who have everything to lose. Okay, that's interesting. So in fact, then if they have everything to lose, they are not going to do anything very much. Anyway, the politics of the state has now, and now Zizek sort of again wanting to differentiate himself from everybody else, says, folks, don't think that the politics of the state is not important. It is important. In fact, it has become very important once again. Why? Because democracy has become de-linked from capitalism. Okay, take a deep breath. So capitalism had hitherto been linked to democracy, and capitalism advanced democracy, and now it has become de-linked, so we now need to worry about democracy, the state, etc., etc. And part of the main reason why capitalism has become de-linked from democracy is because capitalism has moved from profit as its main source of income to rent as its main source of income. I don't know why he still calls it capitalism. I think he should call it, I don't know, landlordism or something like that. But anyway, he says it's moved to rent. And that rent comes primarily from the privatization of the general intellect. That is to say, the privatization of the work of people like him. So the people like him are in the forefront now of this struggle. And so because it is now based on rent, the extraction of this rent is now taking place through through direct political and legal coercion, not the extra economic coercion of the extraction of surplus value. So the epoch of wages, of class struggle over wages, etc., is over. Now all we have to do is talk about not wages, but of citizens' incomes. Exactly how this is not going to involve the state is a different matter. But he says, there's no need to abolish capitalism then. He says that one remains within capitalism. And he agrees with Negri that, we just have to make capitalism kind of pay more attention to the broader social issues. Anyway, and so, and here's where also Zizek and others also makes an extraordinary claim, which is kind of quite amusing, that because of that in cognitive capitalism, human beings themselves, man himself has become fixed capital. The thinker, the creative, the creative class has become fixed capital, and we'll come to that in a minute. So basically, and this person, this cognitive worker, is no longer detached from his means of production because he owns his own computer. Now it's a bit like saying, just because a worker owns his own computer, it means that he is not detached from the means of production. I mean, it's astonishing. It's a bit like saying that just because I own the lever on this machine, that I own all my means of production. No, there is this whole machine of production that you do not own. But this is not, anyway, doesn't bother him. So the struggle is now against the privatization of the general intellect and its controls. And the chief reason to do that is because the reproduction of this cognitive worker must be assured. He has to be able to go to the opera, preferably subsidized by the state, etc., etc. And he also posits that there is now a three-part working class. There is the old manual working class, there is the cognitive working class, and the excluded, who are all unfortunately divided because the old manual working class is now prey to populist fundamentalism. The cognitive class is prey to enlightened hedonism and liberal multiculturalism, while the excluded have even more bizarre forms of belief and organization. And so how are you going to unite all these folks? This is what bothers Zizek. So all you have to do, according to Zizek, is unite them, and then you will have victory. Okay, so now that we have laid out what these folks think, what we can do is we can talk about what the problem here is. So basically, Marx wrote a critique of Proudhon in which he pointed out that Proudhon's ideology rests on the belief that all commodities are more or less directly exchangeable for each other. So, essentially, Proudhon forgets that money plays an important role in it, and of course, money then, as it is stored, also, has the capacity to become capital. Marx famously distinguished between the circuit of commodities and the circuit of capital, MC, M dash, etc. Anyway, so according to Marx, he pointed out that Proudhon opposed a general organization of a labor in society. And so in opposing a general organization of labor in society, essentially any kind of planned economy, what this petty bourgeoisie and Proudhon, people like Proudhon do is they celebrate, so they want to maintain petty property. So to quote Marx, he criticizes Proudhon thus: the same bourgeois consciousness which celebrates the division of labor in a workshop, the lifelong annexation of the worker to a partial operation, his complete subjection to capital as an organization of labor that increases its productive power. So the petty bourgeoisie likes this because this is what he has command over. He commands his workers and he celebrates this. But he denounces, the same man denounces with equal vigor every conscious attempt to control and regulate the process of production socially, as an inroad into the such sacred rights as the right of property, freedom, and the self-determining genius of the individual capitalist. It is very characteristic that the enthusiastic apologists of the factory system have nothing more damning to urge against a general organization of labor in society than it would turn the whole of society into a factory. I hope you grab what's happening here. Basically, for the petty bourgeois, the market is indeed the realm of freedom. The factory, which he owns, is the realm in which he exercises authority. What does the petty bourgeois want the most? What does he fear the most, rather? He fears being in the position that his workers are in. Because any general organization of labor in society would involve, according to him, he knows what he does to his worker. He just does not want anybody to do that to him. That's why he fears the general organization of society. So this sort of person can only think of socialism as the generalization of proletarian subordination. And they cannot conceive of socialism as a socialized collective autonomy of everybody. Okay, so this is the core of the petty bourgeois opposition to centralized planning, etc. So essentially, and so they think that by proposing their loose petty commodity sort of economy, they're proposing a form of socialism. What they also fail to understand is that it is only capitalism that has so thoroughly generalized commodity production. And once it begins to generalize commodity production, what then happens is precisely that small ownership gets mowed down regularly and capitalist enterprises get bigger and bigger. So you really cannot have that. That's why petty producers really resent big property, monopolies, etc., etc. And so the point is that they don't understand that the very capitalism that they would, or the very kind of market socialism they would create, would eventually go back to a form of the capitalism that they fear. So so in this context, so this is the essence of Marxist criticism of Proudhon. Now, if we so if we now take the new communists of the commons, their opposition to state and party is precisely of this character. So Badiou, for example, he talks about how he misunderstands radically the notion of proletarian dictatorship. He thinks that proletarian dictatorship is essentially dictatorship, as in, say, the Pinochet dictatorship or something like that. What he forgets is that the proletarian dictatorship is necessary in a part of the process of the withering of the state, not in the form of an overall organization of society, but as an instrument of class domination. That is to say, when Marx speaks about the withering away of the state, he's not saying that we will not need any central organization of production. Rather, we will need it all the more because capitalism will massify production and it will create huge productive apparatuses which will need central coordination, organization, and so on. So, and in the Paris Commune, for example, he spoke about how this kind of production has to be organized nationally, and then its coordination with other nations also has to be managed. So he has all of these things in mind, but at the same time, you have to have a dictatorship of the proletariat in order to fight the inevitable counter-revolution that will arise. So there is no contradiction, but for these petty bourgeois, the new petty bourgeois, post-communist, new communists of the commons, there is no, all of this is beyond their understanding. As far as they are concerned, the state can only be like the capitalist state. There can never be any kind of a general organization of society which is not authoritarian. So, because the only form of organization they know is their own. They are authoritarian in their own enterprises, and they expect that any such organization will be authoritarian. So okay, so that's the first point. The second point is, what about the commons? Now, like a lot of other people, in fact, like most of the people today, they understand common property to mean nobody's property, and it has never meant nobody's property. Sorry, I'm just, commons has always been defined by complex institutional arrangements which provided rights to defined sets of users and explicitly excluded other sets of users. Essentially, this also means, if you remember, I pointed out to you that one of these guys wants to abolish property as a whole. It's not property that Marx speaks against, it's private property. There will be forms of socialist property which will have to define, so there can be collective property, socialized property, city property, provincial property, state property, etc. And all forms of property have inclusions and exclusions, and so do the commons. If you don't have that, if it's nobody's property, then yes, it is precisely then it will be prey to being taken over by whoever wishes to take it over, and so on. And the Garrett Hardin type tragedy of the commons, etc., will occur. But the point is that historically, commons has always been a specific form of common property. So the sort of free-for-all that Hardin, not to mention Hobbes, feared, the sort of state of nature in which the powerful would be able to appropriate it at the expense of the weak, that's what would happen if you actually had nobody's property, which is what they seem to think the commons is and should be. So no wonder they radically misunderstand property. And of course, Marx would never have misunderstood such things, because I often like to remind people, Marx's first degree was in jurisprudence, it was in the law. So he understood these things and the history of the law. Okay, next we come to something even more interesting and surprising. They want to talk about themselves. They are basically, several of these writers, they want to say that intellectual workers, cognitive workers, whatever, they have themselves become fixed capital. They can say that if they like, but what I mind is that they invoke the authority of Marx to do this. Certainly for Marx, knowledge is a direct force of production. It is a force of production. However, the worker, intellectual or otherwise, can never be fixed capital for Marx. Marx always distinguishes between the worker and his or her living labor and the dead labor, which is fixed capital. Only the first adds value, the second only transfers its value in the process of production. So Marx would have never said that workers of any kind would become fixed capital. Marx does, at one point, have a sentence in which there is the part of the sentence goes, this fixed capital being man himself. But in that section of the Grundrisse, what he is talking about occurs in what he's talking about is he's making a critique of the bourgeois conception of economy or saving. And he means, so by that he means how economy or saving should be viewed and would be viewed in a communist society as a saving of labor time, not the holding of money. The development of the human capacity to produce. Whereas in a capitalist society, such saving takes the form of the accumulation of fixed capital. In a socialist society, he says it would take the form of the development of human capacities. So that's what he's referring to. He's not saying that in capitalism, workers can become fixed capital. This is ludicrous. Okay, so further then, so I won't elaborate too much on that, but that's important. For Marx, capital, fixed or otherwise, can only be seen in capitalist conditions. So Marx often and appropriately spoke of capital as a vampire, dead labor subsisting and growing by extracting the blood, the labor of living workers. But the conversion of workers themselves under capitalism into a category of the undead is a totally surprising thing. So this is like kind of you're having zombie workers. The knowledge producer cannot also be fixed capital for two other reasons. The first is that knowledge production is itself unproductive labor. This is not to damn it. Unproductive labor, all sorts of labor are unproductive labor. A mother raising her child is unproductive labor. It is no less valuable than that. It is unproductive because it does not produce value under capitalism. This is the key. So knowledge production is unproductive labor, and therefore it cannot essentially become any form of fixed capital. Secondly, these people, like the neoclassical economics, they tend to follow more than they follow Marx. They seem to be under the illusion that capital is productive, right? People talk, neoclassical economics talks about the productivity of capital. Capital is never productive for Marx. It is labor that is productive. So whatever the merit of the claim that since capital organizes exploitation by appearing as fixed capital against living labor, the moment the key component of fixed capital is man himself, general social knowledge, the very social foundation of capitalist exploitation is undermined and the role of capital becomes purely parasitic. We don't know what they are saying, but definitely this is not Marx. They cannot claim Marx's authority for saying that. And in fact, they fundamentally misunderstand what it actually value is, because they think that just because something does not produce value, that to call me, unproductive labor, who are you calling unproductive labor, sort of thing. But the fact is that the knowledge does not have value. Marx says, science, generally speaking, costs the capitalist nothing, a fact that by no means prevents him from exploiting it. So knowledge is obviously part of all forms of production, but it is not itself productive of value, nor is it itself have a value. No matter how much you try to give it a value. Further, they talk about capital turning from profit to rent. This also, again, is a complete misunderstanding of the very categories that Marx uses. For Marx, rent is a deduction from profit. It is not, it cannot simply be replaced, it cannot simply replace profit as long as capitalism exists. So, and further, rent from the privatization of, so-called privatization of the general intellect, of the creative class. This kind of, this reference only makes one wonder at the size of these people's ego, which assumes that the only value that commodities embody is that of millions of intellectual workers who are no longer separated from the objective conditions of their labor because they own their own computers. I mean, again, this is hugely problematic. So, yeah, and then of course, Zizek's idea that somehow capitalism used to be connected with democracy and is now not, completely erases from the fact that while capitalism requires a liberal society, it is only the struggles of workers, of women, of other marginalized groups that has actually democratized liberal societies. So this struggle of democracy, it's not something that capitalism has given us. Capitalism only requires a liberal order. It does not require a democratic order. Okay, so finally, I guess I'm coming to the close of my talk. So, you know, Perry Anderson says in his very famous work, Considerations on Western Marxism, he says that Western Marxism was a product of defeat, that Western Marxists inverted the trajectory of Marx's own development because Marx went progressively from philosophy to politics to economics. These people, Western Marxists, have turned back from economics to politics and philosophy. But I would say that this judgment is too kind to these folks. Because quite frankly, I don't think you can understand Marx's, you know, you cannot really separate Marx's economic, political and other analysis and his philosophy from each other. They're all bound up together. And you need some understanding of capitalism's economy in order to understand its politics, its society, its state, etc., etc. So that's precisely because they misunderstand this, the capitalist economy that they do. They misunderstand the capitalist economy because beginning in the 1880s already, with the work of, as I've traced it, Mikhail von Tugan-Baranovsky and then many others, you have had, and I've just recently, by the way, published an article about this, you've had a Marxist economics emerge that has spent all its life trying to fix Marx's analysis into the categories or in the antithetical categories of neoclassical economics. Because this is never a successful enterprise, all it does is it generates complaints. There are three main complaints that I have identified. Number one, Marx's value analysis does not work. It suffers from a transformation problem. Marx could never translate values into prices. Complete rubbish, because Marx has a perfectly adequate explanation. The only reason why these people do not understand it is because they actually do not understand value. They are used to dealing in prices only. That's the only thing neoclassical economics trains them to do. Number two, Marx never said that demand was a paucity of demand was a problem and caused crisis in capitalism. I've written a long article showing evidence from the Grundrisse, from volume 1, from volume 2, from volume 3, which shows uncontrovertibly that Marx said this. For Marx, the paucity of demand was not only a crisis mechanism, but it was the crisis mechanism for him. So I've demonstrated this. And so they only say that because, again, because of neoclassical economics, they tend to think in terms of equilibrium, and they simply cannot deal with the idea that there can actually be something like the paucity of demand. And of course, they also like to dismiss this idea as a Keynesian one. That's another huge discussion we can have. I think Marx and Keynes were a lot closer than most people imagine. Number three, Marx was wrong to say that the rate of profit falls. Again, Marx was not wrong to say that. And every explanation they've trotted out to demonstrate this is complete nonsense. And we can discuss that as well. So you have these wrong understandings of Marxism. You also have a situation in which you can have, you know, rock star Marxists like David Harvey going around saying that there is no history in Capital. If there is no history in Capital, we should throw the book out. because it is precisely the value of capital that it historicizes capitalism and the workings of capital, both in terms of the broader history of humankind in which capital has a certain place, and capital's own history, that is to say the trajectory of capital. Because capitalism is contradictory, it has a history. As they say, there is no saint without a past and no sinner without a future. Anyway, okay, to come back to this then, sorry, where was I? Yeah, so they misunderstand Marx, and therefore they try, then essentially use Marx as a grab bag of ideas, into which from which they can grab anything in order to trick out their own very self-contradictory ideas as radical ideas. So I think maybe in the interest of time, I will end here and we can open it up for discussion.
So I've sent a note to everyone to raise your hand or use the tool for raising, and I'll try to take questions, comments in sequence as they come in. And I have a quick question before we open the floor. The essay and your presentation certainly invite a response. They're very serious. These are the discussion is very serious, and anyone who is claiming to be influenced by Marx in an article like this, as an author of who is subject to the critique in the piece, they should respond. Did you hear from any of these people? Oh.
I feel that there is a certain, some years ago, in fact, just before writing this, a couple of years before writing this, I wrote a very big critique of Benedict Anderson's, what's it called? The big one, Imagine Communities. Because it so happened, I wasn't meaning to write it, but somebody said to me, why don't you write a review of Imagine Communities, because they've just reissued it. And I had read it as a graduate student, and, you know, as one does, say, oh yes, well, fine, whatever. I now sat down and read it again after 2006. And I thought, oh my, what is this guy saying? And then I ended up writing a pretty big critique of it, like, you know, and so, and one of his colleagues in his own department saw this, you know, with whom I was working on in another context. He said, I'm very intrigued by this thing you've written. Can you send it to me? So I sent it to him. So, and he said, can you expand this for me for my journal? So I said, okay. And then I did, and so it became even bigger. And then he showed it to Anderson and says, would you like to respond to this for my journal? And he said, no, we should let the young people do whatever they want. You know, they can have their own discussions, sort of thing. So there you go. Of course, they're not going to answer because they know. I mean, yeah. I mean, in a certain sense, it's a bit like saying, the reason I'm writing this is not because I want to get into an intellectual debate with them. Quite frankly, it would be quite maddening to get into an intellectual debate with them, because the consistency is not their strong point. And like, I'll be tearing my hair out in no time. So that's what my purpose is, actually to get people who are attracted to these ideas to see what's wrong with them. I mean, I don't mind if they're attracted, but they should know what they are. Then they can choose whether they should certainly not think that these are Marxist ideas. That's my main purpose. So, yeah.
So, I have to go page to page. Any questions, comments? And okay, Jem, make sure you're unmuted.
You are muted, Jem.
Jem, you need to unmute.
Okay.
There you are.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. It was wonderful. I learned a lot from you. I have just a short question for understanding. I read many articles from these guys, Zizek and all these postmodern, post-Marxist people, but I've never heard the commons. You talked about the term commons. Can you explain what you mean with commons?
Commons is essentially a term which describes, well, okay, so at least the way they are received in the West, this refers to various, say, typically lands, for example, which were called commons. This is specifically in English history, this has been quite prominent. So there are various lands that were common in the sense that they could not, that they were open for use of many different people.
Oh, yes.
So and so in, I think, the late 60s, this guy called Garrett Hardin, or maybe it was 64, Garrett Hardin wrote a book called The Tragedy of the Commons, in which he argued that the problem with all sorts of common properties, whether it is the air or the open seas or forests or whatever, is that eventually what will happen is that they will be denuded because there is no laws governing them. So he was the one who first introduced this idea that commons are not governed. But the point is, commons are always governed. The commons, so in commons, so for example, you could have commons in which, for example, certain farmers had the right to graze their cattle, while others had the right to walk through them, and yet others may have rights to harvest the fruit of some of the trees on them, etc., etc. So there would be such arrangements, but they were always about specific people. They were not nobody's property or everybody's property. So these people want to use the word commons, and they're not alone. I mean, lots of people have started using the word commons, but in a very loose and ultimately problematic way. Because if you advocate that we should create that sort of commons of the whole world, there is no way of preventing a sort of might is right sort of situation, a Hobbesian state of nature. You have to have laws that govern how things are used. The question is what sort of laws they will be. Will they be individual private property, family property, community property, whatever, some other kind of property? You have to have a decision on that. So there will be property. And that means there will be a state, whether it is local, municipal, national, whatever, but there will be a state that will enforce those property rights.
Yes, yes, very reactionary idea. Now I understand. Yes. Thank you.
So I'm trying to see. Well, in terms of this question of the commons and how these sorts of people and others, there are multiple theorists or historians on the left these days who seem Proudhonist in the end. And it is not just these so-called, that tier of the intellectuals we are dealing with, but there is a tremendous number of people who have scattered the word commons through their language in various ways. The Wages for Housework movement, for example, which still has a lot of currency. We have hosted events with people from this movement, and they are always well attended, and the questions are always disappointing because it is constantly about all the extraction capital that's done into past generations of workers without any acknowledgement of that. And gee, they didn't distribute it right now, well, we can fight for new definitions of what we want, meaning the social wage, but they don't even understand at that level. So we find I find the discussions are very much with a desire for something like the commons, the struggle for that type of commons to work, given the ecological crisis. And what I think as a left face very much is because the nature of the ecological breakdown from capital's speed up of everything and threatening the metabolism of all our species, is that we want to quickly figure out a way to stop this because it's coming at us fast. And I find that there are a lot of people on the left are taking shortcuts and not looking at how the material reality of how capital operates, and want these shortcuts. But there's many of them besides these rock stars of that we see in the news more often.
Sure. I mean, I think that one of the things one has to remember is that people like Garrett Hardin were motivated primarily by a concern for essentially the threat they saw is the threat of the third world. Like, essentially there are all these people in the world, and what if they start claiming all the resources to which the West has such free access via imperialism for such a long time? And so there isn't this underlying anxiety about that. So that's one thing to bear in mind. And the second is that, yes, a lot of the populist or popular movements that invoke this term unknowingly, what they, on the one hand, they want to do is they want to establish some kind of commons, as like this is for everybody in that sense. But they're doing it without any conception of essentially of the or they think that they can do this without the intervention of the state, and that's not going to be possible. You have to deal with the state, you have to democratize the state, and then you have to essentially have a new legal regime that gives more rights to more people, etc., and equalizes the distribution of wealth, etc., etc. So
Shane just wrote something that, can you share that out loud, Shane?
Yeah, I was just saying, you see, I mean, firstly, Hardin wrote that in 1968, and it constantly gets reproduced in environmental science textbooks, every one that I pick up. And it's always right in the preface, right at the start, as if the first thing we've got to say to people is, whatever you do get out of this environmental science, don't think it's about private property relations or anything like that. So let's just use this ancient 1968 article as if there's been nothing done on, as if you would cite anything else, environmental science from that period, except for historical interest, and as if there's been nothing done on the commons. I mean, it's not like he does any historical analysis; he just dismisses it. It's really, and it's private property. It's private ownership of the cattle in a competitive situation over a limited resource of land. It's got nothing to do with the commons at all. Which is kind of what you said. I don't exactly. But the way it gets reproduced over and over in science textbooks is interesting.
Yes.
And Rosemary, you have written here, but are you able to speak, Rosemary? Because I don't know if everyone is looking in the chat bar.
Yes.
She's fixing something there.
Sorry, I'm listening on my desktop and watching on my laptop.
Ah.
So I got myself in two windows here. Just a minute here.
Okay.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I can see the top of your head. Yes.
That's right.
I can't see myself. Wait, okay, there. My head's cut off. Okay.
Yeah, there you are.
Hi, Radhika.
Hi.
Anyway, can you read what I've written?
Sure,
I mean, I can read. I'll read it out loud. When we use the term property, are we not really talking about a social relationship, a relationship of forces in society? Property is not really a thing. It is a concept, a common understanding of a set of rights or privileges that particular groups have in relationship to physical reality, to the things which enable humans individually and in various collectives to organize their ability to live in a particular way. And that's like an agreement that people have amongst themselves, a way of doing things.
I agree. I mean, property is a set of relations, for sure. Yeah.
Dear.
I think Greg says that there are many people have raised their hands electronically.
But
so
the icon's not showing for some reason.
Oh, well, anyway, Greg has a question.
Greg has a
And
question.
I think Fred also has a
Greg
question.
does, and Fred does. So, and then Okay, Greg, you are first, and then Fred, Greg Wilpert, and then Fred Murphy. You both had your hands.
Okay, thanks.
Try to raise your hand on screen because the icons aren't working. And then Vinay, you will be after Fred. That's the next three people. Okay, go ahead, Greg.
You can also use the chat to put yourself on the stack or raise your hand.
So Radhika, I think your criticism of these kind of 21st century Proudhonists is, I think it's very important, extremely important to be making. And I think you point out some really interesting criticisms that I wasn't aware of. I mean, I've been following their work for a while, but I think it's very important. But on the other hand, I'm the kind of person who's always looking for ways to kind of synthesize arguments, to bring them back together. And so I'm wondering if, let me just throw this out, and I'm not sure if I'm going to express it properly or if it's going to be completely coherent because it's a really huge, complex topic. But if I understand you correctly, one of your main criticisms of is clearly their kind of effort to move away from any kind of dictatorship of the proletariat, control of the role of the state, and so on. And to me, I mean, that, and also I think to Marx, the role of the state was always considered to be something in a transition toward socialism or communism was supposed to be something transitional. And that's why the whole concept of the withering away of the state. In other words, can't we still hold on to the notion or the value of the commons? And let me explain why. And while still also maintaining this transitional idea of the state, which would eventually wither away among a proliferation and the predominance of the commons the way you have outlined, not as a place that is somehow under no one's control, as numerous other people have pointed out, and I think the most important theorist in this, I think, still remains Elinor Ostrom, who pointed out specifically what you have said also about the rules that govern the commons, and that's and the membership, the in-group, the out-group, as a part of the ownership and control over the commons. The reason I think the commons is making a huge comeback isn't just because of these theorists, but also because we have two new forms of commons that have, so to speak, presented themselves to us as a society. One of them being kind of this knowledge commons as being very important, which is something that I would say, has clearly acquired a much bigger importance in the 21st century because of the internet and the interconnectedness and all of that. And the other one, of course, being making a comeback is the commons of nature. And in fact, you have to add a third. And I think Nick Dyer Witherford, if I get his name correctly, does this, is a social commons, which is basically the cooperative forms of organization. So we've got these three fundamentally different, not fundamentally different, but three types of commons that we ought to be thinking together and as being kind of the long-term horizon with the help of a socialist state and a socialist party. That's the way I'd like to think of it. I just want to see what your reaction is.
Yeah. Okay, so you asked two quite distinct questions. So let me take them one by one. So first of all, I would say that my problem with these new communists is that, I think that not dealing with the state is a huge problem, because the withering away of the state will only come at a relatively late stage. And that withering away does not mean that there will be no need for planning and coordination. So really, there's a huge, essentially, mix-up. So when Marx speaks about the withering away of the state, what he means is the withering away of class domination. For Marx, that is the state. The state is an instrument of class domination. Insofar as the state is a apparatus to organize the common affairs of a people, it will still be necessary. And that is what they are trying to reject while using so what they do, like Proudhon, and because being the Proudhonists they wish to reject any common organization of the common affairs of a people. That is what would then that essentially then already concedes the ground. It is basically saying, let's not have any kind of revolution. It imagines that we can have a kind of a sea of petty property, sort of E.F. Schumacher type, small is beautiful, etc. But the problem with capitalism is that precisely it uses these ideas of small scale competitive enterprises in order to justify a reality of big monopoly capital, which is already planning production on a massive scale. Today, the biggest corporate, who does most planning? The biggest corporation, the head of Amazon, can plan his production down to exactly how many paper clips the lowest paid secretary needs to buy. Okay, because of information technology, he is able to do that. Socialism will need to plan. They are rejecting that. And I think that's where I don't, look, if they come to the same demonstration with me, I will march with anybody. I'm not going to have conceptual disputes with them, but they are not going to come. They are distracting the attention of young people away from that. That's why I also say this is a form of neoliberalism of the left. And it has unfortunately very deep roots. As I say, neoclassical economics started addling the minds of various Marxists a long time ago. And believe me, I'm going to send Michael, I wrote 3 or 4 articles on this. I'm going to send Michael that, or you can ask me, I'm easily contactable. I'd love to send you these articles because they are very, very important. So that's my first part of my answer to your question. As far as the commons are concerned, I really think that, well, first of all, nature, sociability for that matter, knowledge, all of these are in some sense the common heritage of humanity. But in order to really make them the common heritage of humanity, we are going to have to devise a new set of laws, both national and international. The way to that is not to declare them as a commons. If you declare them as a commons, the big property is going to start exploiting them totally freely. This kind of nobody's property is, Garrett Hardin made it out to be a dystopia. For these, a lot of these people, it has become a new utopia. It's neither, they're completely on the wrong track. I would love, why is it that some countries, Canada, I live in a country that occupies a vast landmass with only 30 million people. 35 million people. Who is to say that this, first of all, it's been taken away from other people to begin with, right? So, the first, the native indigenous communities of this land. My point is that, yes, it should be, but the point, but there has to be rules and regulations about how this is done. And this is not going to be done without the state. Not least because today we have such vast concentrations of productive power that can also organize their own protection, that we will need to have our democratic states, and quite powerful ones, for a very long period of time until these powers have been dismantled and socialized before we are ever going to get to socialism. It's odd, the bigger these private powers get, the more we talk as though we don't need the state. I find that so bewildering. And I think there's another element here, in the quote that I read out where I wanted to illustrate the self-importance of these guys. They talk about this guilt, we are no longer guilty. We are happy to declare ourselves socialists. I think that one of the big problems is that the left, in addition to misunderstanding Marx, the left has essentially in Western countries taken the route of saying, oh, well, we don't want Soviet style or Chinese style socialism or whatever anyway, so we don't have to deal with that. No, folks, you have to deal with it. You have to understand what happened, why it happened, what was good about it, what was bad about it, because unless you do, you're not going to be able to understand what is involved in going beyond capitalism. You may not approve of them. I'm not suggesting that we should approve of everything that happened. What I am saying, however, is that it did happen. It didn't happen because there was some evil, blame it all on Stalin, No. Stalin was also a phenomenon. Like I go, Moshe Levin, for example, in my view, has written wonderful books about, all his writings on the Soviet Union, to me, bear this out, that it came out, a very good part of the Stalin phenomena is accounted for the fact accounted from the difficulties of building communism in a backward country. Anyway, I go on too much, but you see my point, yeah. So I agree that, and you know, Marx is also very clear. I mean, you know, nature, and in fact, I love to talk about nature and second nature, because what is second nature? It is our culture, right? So nature and second nature are the common heritage of humanity. When they, interestingly, they talk about, they're worried about the privatization of the intellect. What they're talking about is intellectual property rights and so on. But actually, the most discerning writers about intellectual property rights have also pointed out that the United States has been in the forefront of trying to create an intellectual property rights regime that's where its effort has been concentrated on trying to secure secure its power over certain ideas. But the fact is, you can do that, but they will soon, like, securing a patent over an idea is not the way to, you can successfully monopolize it, because even if you have a patent, other countries may not agree with the patent, and you cannot prevent others from learning. And once they learn, they will get that knowledge. The problem is not that some people are monopolizing, trying to monopolize intellectual property. The real issue is that there are many countries in the world that do not have the capacity to receive that knowledge because they are not investing in the education of their people. Once they invest in the education of, in order to receive technology, you have to have a vessel. For technology, what is the vessel? The vessel is an educated workforce that is able to take the technology, absorb it, understand it, and use it. So that's the real barrier to spreading knowledge. Otherwise, the Chinese, so they don't respect intellectual property, and good for them. Why should they? You know, as I said at one point, I said, try launching a rocket without the zero, right? I mean, are you going to use Roman numerals to launch rockets? No. Now, who are you going to give the intellectual rent for so-called Arabic numerals, which actually came from India too? You know, I mean, this is our common heritage. We cannot say it is mine or yours, right? And knowledge is not used up. If I use it, it's not used up. You can use it too. It's a non-excludable good. So I cannot exclude you from using it. Anyway, so I've gone on for enough, too long. But yeah.
Okay. We have straightened out the Zoom technology with the hand raising not working for me when I was calling on people. Garrison got on top of it, and he's the next questioner, and he is going to, he's put it in the chat, but the sequence of next questions he has as well. Garrison, the floor is yours.
Yeah, sure. So I'll go, and then the current stack after me is Vinay, then Ewan, then Miguel, then Anitra, then Fred. And then my question is, earlier you briefly mentioned David Harvey, and Harvey, at least from like my experience in like the Youth Democratic Socialists of America, is probably the most popular source for when someone goes to like read Capital. His lectures just pop up immediately. And I guess my question is, if you're aware of the argument he had with William Clare Roberts when his book on the Republican political theory in Capital, Marx's Inferno, came out, where Harvey did a review in which he basically said like he disagreed with like the idea of Marx as like a political like arguer, basically, and then he and Roberts went back and forth, and so I'm just wondering what would you like categorize as what's like if people ask me like, does Harvey have like a misconception of Marx, what do you think that is?
Okay, so first of all, let me say that I love David Harvey's book on Paris. And generally speaking, I think he should stick to those sorts of books. He does them very well. And I think the Condition of Postmodernity's best parts were also the ones that were about art and culture and whatever. But I must say that Harvey's politics in the Condition of Postmodernity, and later on as well, they are no different from the what I'm calling the Proudhonist economics and network politics. So that's my first point. Second is that as far as I can tell, and I have not read all of Harvey's works on capital simply because I'm sufficiently put off by what I've seen that I don't feel that that would be the best use of my time. And many of his works are very long. So I put that out because maybe, some of you have better arguments than mine. But my argument would be that I feel that Harvey also has essentially a Marxist economics conception of capital, that is to say. And I know that because at one point, and this is a half-written article that I have never finished, but I wanted to take on his argument that there is no history in capital. And what I have already written of that article already shows that he is essentially imposing a neoclassical frame on Marxist political economy. He therefore does not understand what the problematic of classical political economy was. That's very key. In fact, I've written a very short encyclopedia entry for a thing called the Bloomsbury Companion to Marx. It's just entitled Political Economy, and it actually goes into the question of where political economy was at when Marx arrived at it, sort of circa 1850, when he decided to do a serious analysis of capitalism, etc. So, sitting in the British Library and so on. So, and in that, I show exactly what that problematic is, and it is not the problematic of neoclassical economics, because the very notion of value is alien to it. And Harvey, I don't think Harvey fully understands that. He may understand a lot of other things. And by the way, I should also add that I have only listened to one, or I think maybe only one of his lectures. I just happened to chance on it ages ago, and I listened to it. And my impression is that he tends to his lectures are really obiter dicta. He talks around what Marx is saying simply because I don't think he has the capacity to engage with what Marx actually says in each of the chapters or sections that he is lecturing on. That's my impression.
Thank you.
Okay, Vinay, you are the next. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Yeah, Vinay. Totally fine. Thank you so much. Yeah. So first and foremost, thank you so much, Professor Desai. This was very illuminating. I really appreciate it. This is more of a clarification thing because I'm just starting with my readings of Marx. You've mentioned Zizek, and you mentioned one thing that he said, which confused me, which was that he said the proletariat are those who have everything to lose. Could you further elucidate this? Because from my understanding, mainly from you, of the proletariat is that their power rests in their collective action, but that's only potential. And so if we take Marx's ideas of alienation in his 1844 manuscript, they seem to be on the edge morally. If we take his idea of surplus value, they'll also seem to be on the very edge economically. So if this is the case, then how can someone take these writings and say, well, the proletariat has everything to lose? It seems almost counterintuitive. Could you please further elucidate? Thank you.
So Marx says at the end of the Communist Manifesto, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. So it's a reference to that. And I think this idea that they have nothing to lose has been a little bit of a oversimplified understanding. So in some of my other writings, I've pointed out that what a lot of people don't understand about the Second International and why it disintegrated the way it did. It didn't just disintegrate sort of one fine day when the guns of August began to shoot. In fact, it disintegrated, or rather, it was already well before the beginning of the First World War, composed of quite national parties. Okay, and those national parties, particularly, many of those national parties had become very large precisely by gaining concessions for the working class from their governments, whether they were pensions or unions or whatever, very small, not very large concessions, but nevertheless concessions that made working class life better. So one of the historians of the Second International, James Joel, points out that therefore by the time August 1914 rolled around, these workers had more to lose than their chains, so to speak. So that's another thing. And that's, I think, also One of the other things that, well, in my presentation on the last presentation I'm going to do with Michael, as presently planned, will be this commentary I'm going to do on the last few pages of the Grundrisse, which is a section entitled Carey and Bastiat. There, Marx is talking about two little known economists, Henry Carey, the American, and forget his first name, was it Frederick Bastiat, I think, of France. And so one is a free trader, the other is a protectionist. And where I'm going with this is that Marxists themselves think that Marx essentially thought of the world economy as a single whole whose division into nations did not matter. This is also very problematic. And I think it's one of the reasons why the left's understanding of capitalism is very weak, is because it does not understand that national economies are not just incidental. It's not just that, you know, there was a Tower of Babel and we started speaking different languages, so there are nations are these incidental divisions of humankind. No, capitalist development itself, its logic of uneven and combined development, actually requires that capitalism, the world capitalism will be composed of national capitalisms. And so the nation is as central a category as classes. Marx even says at one point in his writings on free trade, he says something, I'm paraphrasing now, he put it much more cuttingly. He says, what are we to make of these gentlemen who do not understand how a nation can exploit another nation? Why should we expect them to understand how a class can exploit another class? So for him, there, and in many other such places, he puts nation and class next to each other. You cannot understand contemporary capitalism without putting the nation as a central category in it. And Marx understood this. So that's the reference. So when Zizek says, you know, they have everything to lose, I mean, this is just kind of some kind of a showmanship, you know, like, look, I'm overturning what Marx says, nothing to lose, everything to lose. Like, you don't even know what he really means. And maybe he, like all these cognitive capitalists, have everything to lose. You know, they have much anyway to lose. So yeah, whatever.
Okay, Ewan, from your next. You have to unmute. Okay.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much for the presentation. I wrote my question in the chat, but I can just read it out.
Please.
Which is that, yeah, thank you for the presentation. You pointed to how 21st century Proudhonists refer to people excluded from industrial wage labour and suggest the need to revise a notion of what the proletariat is and how to do communist politics. You suggest they're mistaken and they don't anyway actually listen to the excluded people they claim to speak for. Can I ask, what my question is though, if they are mistaken, do you think we do need to update Marx in any way, e.g. his concept of the working class, its nature as a revolutionary subject, or roots beyond exploitation in light of the changing world of work? I guess I'm thinking especially of people risking their lives migrating to access somewhat stable employment and being excluded by escalating border controls. So with this in mind, also a kind of a secondary question is, do you think questions of migration management and the national orientation of much class politics poses any challenge to the national state institutions as a means of socialist transition? And I guess that follows on from what you were just saying in response to a previous question.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you are asking some $64 million questions, so I'm going to do my best here. So first of all, I would say that you ask whether Marx's notion of the working class needs revision. I would say that okay, cautiously, I would say this. I would say that Marx does not feel that only those people who are actually employed are working class. I think everybody who needs to work for a living is in the working class. And today that includes everybody from the most privileged workers, unionized workers, benefits, pensions, etc., all the way down to the informal sector workers in third world countries who eke out a very miserable living. So it includes all of these people. Okay. The second thing I would say is that I think when you are discussing demography and migration, well, I guess I would like to say two things. You know, ages ago, I read Saskia Sassen's very wonderful book, Guests and Aliens. I think it's worth reading because it points out that migration, you know, today we talk of, especially with all these deaths in the Mediterranean, etc., we have this image of this kind of tide of humanity that is going to arrive in all the rich countries. And of course, this leads to all kinds of fears in the minds of people and so on. So I think we need to revise that. I think Sassen makes a very good point that migration takes place along very determinate routes. So the unfortunate thing is that her analysis stops at circa 1914, just when, you know, the contemporary era of migration kind of begins. So and it largely concerns migration within Europe, but I would say that, you know, Filipino nurses don't end up in Britain or America without clear agreements between the government of the Philippines and these governments to say how many nurses are you going to train and how are they going to arrive and what are you going to, so there are these agreements and they are all in place. Temporary migrant workers come from the same villages to the same cities in Canada, same villages in Central America to the same cities in Canada year after year. This is not something chance that there are just too many people in the world. And I think also, you know, when I teach my politics of development class, I always get the students to first of all read this very wonderful little book. It's short, it's sweet, and it's to the point. By Vanessa Baird. It's by one of these new internationalist publications called The No-Nonsense Guide to World Population. Because the tendency of people to say that the only problem of the third world is that there are just too many people there is so huge, you have to deal with it frontally and say, look, read this book and let's lay that aside and then we can discuss the real issues. Because I got fed up to hear of being told time and again that the only problem is population. One of the interesting things Baird says in that book is that if we were willing to put up with levels of population density of New York City, we could fit the entire population in the world in a territory the size of Texas. So let's also consider that. Okay, that's an important thing to bear in mind. So then finally, migration. You also have to remember one other thing. Typically, when you have the establishment of capitalism, for reasons we can go into if you want, typically there is a huge upsurge in population, which then stabilizes at a higher level, and then it sort of remains at that level. Europe had the luxury of exporting its population to 5 continents. Third world countries today have no such luxury. The levels of migration we are seeing now are minuscule as a proportion of the total population than we witnessed before 1914, when Europe colonized and settled 5 continents or whatever, however many there are. So I think that, and so what happened to the people? Otherwise, those people would have created vast slums, and they were already creating vast slums in Europe, right? So that's another thing we have to bear in mind. And so today what we are witnessing is the demographic transition of third world countries is taking place at much lower levels of material well-being than for Europeans. Today, my contemporaries who are Canadians, you know, here, they are maybe 1 or 2 generations away from very large families. Okay, maybe, and they are often themselves part of very large families. You see now that in places like India and many other places, there is already a demographic transition taking place at a much lower level of well-being. So I think these are the sorts of things we have to bear in mind that when we talk about migration, population, working class, etc. And so a final point is that you see, in the case of many the people who are living in slums right now, in say New Delhi or Bombay or what have you, these people in some ways it would be, the question is whether they can ever return to the land. Because think about it this way, Europe's surplus population was pushed off the land, but it was successfully repeasantized when they arrived as settlers and became farmers in new territories, whether in Canada or America or Australia or New Zealand or where have you. So in a certain sense, they reacquired some kind of capacity to make their own living, whereas this is again becoming less possible for the people who are in the slums in third world countries, but they are definitely part of the working class. So I hope that sort of answers your question, but these are huge questions. So I've tried to do my best. Sorry, that's my dog. So.
I think, Miguel, you are the next person.
Okay, thank you, and Radhika, thank you very much for your presentation. It was fascinating. I particularly liked your characterization of this new Proudhonist school as the, I think you called them the neoliberals of the left. And you know, many of these, you could say post-Marxist and postmodernist schools of thought, you know, essentially wrap themselves in Marxism, but strip it of its revolutionary essence, its revolutionary core. And as such, can't help but feel as it's kind of a way station for them on their way to reconciling themselves to capitalism in one form or another. I wanted to say just a word about the question of the state, because it's come up a number of times. Marx and Engels, especially in their late writings, including volume 3 of Capital, which Engels completed, talk a lot about the state, but they always caution that we shouldn't use the word state as a kind of a generic term. The state is always a reflection of the socioeconomic formation that it serves. So when they talked about the tasks of the working class on assuming power, of winning the battle for democracy, as stipulated in the Communist Manifesto, that one of their first tasks, even before starting to build socialism, is in fact to dismantle or smash the capitalist state, and to form a new working class state, which that state would then gradually wither away on the route to communism. But this idea that I mean, it was Kautsky and others in the Second International who wanted to transform that into reforming the state, of gradually evolving the state to serve the interests of the oppressed classes, of the exploited classes and whatnot. And Marx and Engels, and by the way, Lenin in State and Revolution really makes this very clear by going back to the essentials, to Marx and Engels' own writings, to show, in fact, that this was a kind of a distortion. And well, now we have social democracy. That's where it led to. I wanted to just ask you a question about the point that you made with respect to the proletariat itself, and the fact that a number of these writers are kind of chopping at the base of the proletariat, not only differentiating and breaking them up into fragmented sections, but also suggesting that the proletariat itself is somehow shrinking. Well, my reading of the world over the past 30 or 40 years is, in fact, there is a proletarianization process, that more and more people are joining the working class. It's not getting smaller. It doesn't mean that they all have a revolutionary proletarian class consciousness. It doesn't mean that there isn't stratification within the working class, but objectively, the working class is growing. And I was interested to get your views on this whole question of proletarianization or deproletarianization. Sorry about that.
No, I would agree with you that the proletariat is growing, not least because if you define the proletariat as the group of people who need to work in order to make their living, they have no ability to make their living, they don't have access to their means of production, then that class is growing simply because more and more people are being pushed off the land across the world through a variety of means, precisely because more and more land is being privatized and so on. So that class is definitely growing. I agree with you. Yeah. And I agree with you with your statements about the state and entirely. I think this is exactly, you have the right understanding, and these folks, they don't have the right understanding. They think that we are somehow going to arrive at socialism without dealing with the state, and this is not so. And in fact, yeah, that reminds me. So there is this. So yeah, two other things very quickly. I also discuss the way in which they discuss Marx's understanding of the Paris Commune, right? Marx's understanding of the Paris Commune is very profound, and they somehow say, oh, this is too ambiguous. Why do they find it problematic? Because Marx points out that you needed to take over the state and to change the state. So he lists, actually, if I can find it, Marx lists all the things that the commune did, which were essentially transforming the state into something radically new. Here it is: the suppression of the standing army and the substitution for it of the armed people, the merging of executive and legislative power, the enforcement of accountability on the police, public service at workmen's wages, education and science freed from the state and church influence, provided free, among others. So he's just listing all the things that the commune did, which were to transform the existing state, which was essentially a state to enforce class domination, into a state that would do the bidding of the revolutionary people of the commune. And so, since this still involves the state, this is something that Zizek and others don't want to have anything to do with. The second thing is about reform and revolution. I think towards the end of this article, if you're interested, you can take a look. I have a discussion of reform and revolution. Obviously, reformism is wrong. That is to say, the idea that all we have to do is reform capitalism in a few ways and then everything will be fine. No, you have to, that's not enough. But that does not mean that reforms are to be poo-pooed. Reforms are critical, and very often you can request some very minor reform, which then becomes a spark for revolution, because the ruling class may be unwilling or unable to fulfill that demand. And the working class is ready to say, okay, if you can't do it, we'll do it ourselves. That's a revolution, right? So, you know, take peace, bread and land. I mean, how reformist can you get? I mean, these were pretty minimal demands, but the Tsarist state was unable to provide them. That's why you got a revolution, right? So one has to, you know, yeah, take that into account. But yeah, thank you.
So the next person is Anitra, who is also coming in from Australia. Anitra, you're up.
Yeah, look, my question, I come from a kind of non-market socialist position. Okay, so I'm not so worried about vacating the state, although I think that the whole emphasis then needs to be on politics, and it needs to be on subsidiarity and local direct control of production. And what that does is avoid the counter movement to vacating the state, which is really to occupy the market as if it's some benign area. However, see, the problem with the current state is that it's so market-based, so market-framed, and it seems incredibly difficult to change it because of the size of the state, and we have a lot of politics which is basically national and international. So it sort of seems to me that one needs to be working to minimizing and making more direct democracy rather than representative democracy. And in that way, once people have direct control of production, the market withers in that sense. So I just wondered if you kind of would like to comment on that.
I mean, that's an interesting point. So first of all, I would say that you're absolutely right that the state capacities of the present day states have actually been whittled down massively. So that, you know, that's partly why I've also been writing a great deal about this virus business. And so, you know, coronavirus and what it tells us about capitalism and so on. And one of the things we are witnessing, and certainly in the UK and in all neoliberal economies, is that the state is unable to, or rather the state has become habituated to solving every problem, or rather using every problem as an opportunity to give more money to corporations. So instead of giving money to the National Health Service to organize track, trace, etc., they give money to big corporations who can only fuck it up. I'm sorry to say it. They are doing it royally, and lives are being lost as a consequence. So absolutely, I think that one of the things, in a sense, you make a very good point that, in the past, the fear was, oh, people will take over the stage and it is this massive organization capable of doing so many authoritarian things. In fact, right now, we have an extremely inept state. And if we were to take this over, we would have to develop a lot of state capacities to do various things, which it does not have. And in fact, it has lost even from the, 30 years ago. These capacities have been lost. So does that answer your question, or maybe I misunderstood your question?
Anitra, you need to unmute. Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, I think we've only got a quarter of an hour left, so I'm happy for you to move on to other people's questions.
Okay, thanks.
Fred, you are the next person.
Yeah, thanks very much. This whole conversation has been fascinating, and I've taken a lot of notes for further thinking. I got on this stack back at the time when we were talking about the commons, and the discussion seems to have moved on from there. But I would just make one point, I think, which is worth considering, which is the notion of the commons partly arises out of the primitive accumulation chapters of Capital, where Marx stresses the abolition of the commons effectively and the inter of the commons. The commons, in his understanding, being the common property of the people on the land where they grazed their herds, or where they divided up each year of who was going to sow what crops and what spaces and so on. And that was the crucial moment in the formation of the early proletariat, of those who no longer have anything to lose because they have lost their access to the common property that they had. Now, of course, the peasants in those times did regulate their common property in very important ways. It was not the property of no one. It was the property of the commune or the village or the collective of the peasants, of the working people on the land. So that's a whole aspect of the commons that I think is very valuable to retain, but to understand, and there are ways in which you can make analogies to that, to the present day, in which the capitalists continue to enclose aspects of or vestiges of common property, or things that we all thought were entirely common and never to be violated, such as water and air. Ask the folks in California if the air is being enclosed. Ask the people along the Colorado River if the water is being enclosed. So in terms of agitating against the encroachments of capital on people's common lives, I think it's still a useful concept. And it's that these new communists of the commons are gesturing toward, but they're doing so in a counterproductive way that Radhika has explained. So that's my 2 cents on the commons.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. That's absolutely right. Yeah.
So, are there other questions? I did not get more questions in the stack. Is Garrison still here? Did you see any other questions, Garrison?
No, I did not.
Okay. Oh, there is. Philippe. Yes, Philippe. Go ahead.
Well, I have a...
You have to speak closer to your mic, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, much better.
Okay. You titled your paper, The New Proudhonist, yet referring to the new communist and resurrecting somewhat the arguments between the Marxist-Leninist left and the socialist-libertarian left. Why didn't you call it anarchist? How is this discourse different?
Oh, it's only, I only call them communists because that's what they are saying. They want to revive the idea of communism. So one of their publications is the idea of communism. So they are saying that we are, they are, let me make sure I remind myself of what exactly I call them. I said they are the new communists of the commons. So they themselves give themselves the name communists and say we are communists. We want to revive the idea of communism. We want to relate it to the commons. We want to relate it to all these other things, including cognitive capitalism and etc. etc. So it's there.
Do you think it's a revisionism, or is it just an attempt at transforming Marxism into socialist libertarianism?
I suppose it would be the latter. I would say it is the latter, but I would say that it's not even, I have to say at some level I have a relatively low opinion of these people, because they're not interested in doing anything seriously. They are simply interested in essentially becoming sort of like celebrities, you know, well-known people whose ideas are discussed and all of that. That seems to me, I don't think they're serious revolutionaries or leftists, or their project is not serious. It's about themselves. It's like Zizek. Zizek will say anything so long as you put him, give him a platform. Anyway, so I would say that these words are to me I'm not so invested in them. If you said that I had used the wrong words, I would agree. I'm just explaining to you that the reason I use them is because that's what they are saying. They are saying that's who we are.
I see.
Yeah, so I said, okay, so these new communists, they're calling themselves communists, but they're actually 21st century Proudhonists, which is kind of not dissimilar from what you're talking about socialist libertarianism. I mean, the reason why I said what I said about the neoliberalism of the left, and I said what I said about what really happened with the generation of 68, is that I also wanted to draw attention to the fact that there is a certain sense in which a certain individualism was at the core of this new left, so to speak. So you always have, so I even remember, for example, a book that was written called Arguments for a New Left by Hilary Wainwright, in which Hilary Wainwright, who is a very nice person, I know her, she says, oh, we must learn from Hayek about how to organize a market economy. And I'm just going, and also the crazy thing is that Hayek's understanding of even of how prices are formed is simply wrong. But that's what you get. Most price theory, because the whole idea is how do you allocate resources? So the market is the best mechanism because the market is a sort of ongoing auction. Market is not an ongoing auction. For most producers, they have to take prices as a given, right? They pre-exist because Marx is Marx is said to have a theory of value, but did he understand price? No, Marx has a far better theory of price than any of these people who talk only about price and know nothing about value. So as I say, this is not the only reason I even. Well, first of all, I wrote it because I was invited to say something about these people, and then I kind of, as one does, got into it and decided I was going to do a thoroughgoing critique, and also because my real audience is not them. I have no desire to get into debate with them. It is to inform people who would otherwise be misled about the real character of this thinking.
So what do they mean by, I'm jumping in without, no one else has a question. I've tried to read this Empire and Multitude, and it just seems rather like making it up as one goes along, even though one does get the sense that it is trying to be the new definers of what a social class is, and but avoids class altogether, and why the class formations even came about. And there was a definite, besides the Proudhonist aspect, there is almost this mystical approach that I found hard to penetrate, and it moves in and out of this with the sleight of hand that I didn't really trust in terms of a style of presenting something that's such a breakthrough. But I don't even know when some of the people that I've spoken with amongst our circle at the MEP have said that many people have moved past the discussion of many of these guys. And I don't see evidence of that when there was a large event with Michael Hardt at the May Day Center out in Brooklyn. There were people literally hanging off the rafters. It was so crowded, and it wasn't even that well announced. It happened in a very short time period. This kind of thing happens. So even though our left is miserably small and way too small, there are enough numbers in a former church to bring a lot of people for Michael Hardt at short notice. So at the same time, Greg, who left here, I wanted to hear more of what he meant by trying to work out, almost like negotiate with the superstars. But Radhika, you'd already said you're not interested. However, there are a lot of followers of these people, and I don't even know if they can recite, if they're even fluent in the language. How does one blend Zizek with Negri, and which period of Negri, without becoming completely confused and not being able to explain something? The point that I find very disruptive to them is that they do, in some ways, almost intentionally use obscure language that is unnecessary if you want to communicate and make a real challenge to capital. But some of your closing comments about this would be good, and
sure.
But also give us a preview of your visit on October 31st to discuss pre-capitalist economic formations.
Okay, so well, what you were saying about the popularity of these figures reminds me of another thing that I feel about these kind of writings. So first of all, I would say that, I mean, the whole postmodernism, post-structuralism stuff was also part of the neoliberalism of the left on the one hand. Secondly, I would say that despite all protestations about how free American academic life is, actually over the neoliberal decades, basically any serious left thinking has essentially been hounded out. So what you get is essentially a lot of thinking that it's a way of people who are not actually leftists to feel that they are progressive. Okay, so somehow to assuage their consciences, to say this is really for the good of people, etc. So that's a second thing. And really, their main audience is actually in the universities. It's not in the movements or anything like that. So it's basically to make various faculty members and students think that, oh, and also there's another tendency. I mean, it has always puzzled me why these people constantly refer to Marx. Well, I think they constantly refer to Marx for a number of reasons. Of course, Marx is a tremendous source of ideas. So as I say, for them, he's a grab bag of ideas. They can pick and choose, and they can say, look how smart I am, etc. Secondly, I think that they genuinely, their purpose is in fact to say, okay, I'm going to tell you what Marx said, so you never have to read Marx. That's another thing that happens. So don't read Marx, read my book. It will tell you everything you need to know. So that's another thing. And I would say, I suppose the third thing is simply that because Marx is such a towering intellectual figure, you have to somehow show that you have something better than him. And that's kind of what they're trying to do. So that's one set of ideas that I have about the, why these people are so popular. But also I feel that at some level, perhaps one shouldn't worry too much, because if people are so easily guiled by this stuff, then they are not exactly going to become revolutionaries tomorrow. The revolutionaries are elsewhere. And that's where you have to look for them. So that's a final point on that. In terms of a preview of what I'm going to discuss under, so what I'm proposed to do is I'm going to discuss that section of the Grundrisse, which Eric Hobsbawm published in the 50s or 60s, I forget, as pre-capitalist economic formations. And what I want to do by doing that is I want us to understand understand what Marx said about previously existing societies, whether it is antiquity, feudalism, Asiatic mode of production, blah, blah, etc. I want to reinterpret it radically, because most of the debates around it are surrounded by these ideas of, was Marx a stagist? Does every society have to go through these various modes of production, etc. And there are all sorts of false, what did he mean by the Asiatic mode of production? Did he really want to say that India was static or whatever, Oriental despotism, blah, blah, and so on. So I want to cut through all of that because I feel that while these debates have generated some fascinating literature, and I have benefited from reading quite a bit of it, not all of it by any stretch of the imagination. Over the years, as I have read and taught these texts, I feel that there is a completely different interpretation of Marx's understanding of pre-capitalist societies that I would like to present to you. So that's what I'm going to do. And it's really, I guess I will say that and leave it at that. So if you're curious, please do come. I would love to, as I say, present my interpretation to you. And I particularly want to thank all the people who are staying up late or getting up very early for coming, because the Zoom is great, but it does mean that one has to do these sorts of things every so often. So thank you very much.
Radhika, you have achieved something. Almost every time people from Australia say, too bad, I'd like to come. You had 3 people from Australia here tonight.
Thank you.
That is quite an achievement.
Thank you, Australians.
And Ewan is staying up fairly late, and Chum is in Turkey, so this has been, this really points out how international our proletariat is and how we can start communicating with each other unlike any time in the past. What I find striking, even though I don't know what the organizations are behind the general strikes in India, every year it seems that there is a national general strike that is approaching near 200 million people, and not for just a day. This is even if these are not even well positioned, even if the ideology and the unions are not that great, getting that many people together shows how many proletarians are being created in the world. And now we have the ability to act with one another unlike ever before. We just have to know what we're acting about, which is the challenge for this next period. But, and Radhika, we look forward to you coming 2 more times. And okay. I am so pleased all of you took the time to come and stayed. And I know that we could keep talking, but it wouldn't be fair to people who are up until the middle of the night or early morning. And thank you so much, Radhika.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for coming. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Oh, wait, before everyone jumps off, is it okay if I share your article with the people who signed up for it?
Absolutely, please send it off.
And I have to ask people, because we advertise with our site, Facebook, and Eventbrite. Eventbrite will cut the MEP off if we solicit people for anything, but if everyone says it's okay to send to them, just put your hand up or something. Okay. All right. I just need to have that permission.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you, Radhika, and have a great night.
Thank you, folks. You too. Bye-bye. And Australians, have a wonderful day. Yes.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, great meeting all of you.
Yeah, thanks.